Sometimes the price of delay is a battle. Sometimes it's an entire civilization. Late in the summer of 466 BC, the coast of Pamphylia hid something the Greeks would rather not have found. At the mouth of the Eurymedon River, where muddy current meets deep Mediterranean blue, a Persian fleet had sat at anchor for weeks. Roughly 350 Phoenician and Cilician warships packed along the shore. This was no patrol. It was an invasion force, waiting only for reinforcements. Persia had not forgotten Salamis. 14 years had passed since Xerxes watched his fleet break apart under Greek rams. 14 years of humiliation and quiet rebuilding. The Achaemenid Empire believed it had time on its side, time no single Greek city could match. But while the Persian camp calmly counted supplies and awaited 80 Phoenician ships from Cyprus, one Athenian was studying those same waters through intelligence reports. His name was Cimon, son of Miltiades, the same Miltiades who had routed Persian infantry at Marathon a generation earlier. Cimon inherited more than his father's fame. He understood that Persia's strength only mattered once it had time to unfold. Strike while the giant is still moving, and it falls. As Athens' strategos, Cimon treated the war with Persia as his life's work. He counted ships, checked grain reserves, and personally questioned merchants returning from Anatolia. According to Plutarch, it was Cimon who quietly turned the Delian League from a defensive pact into an offensive weapon. The League had begun as a coalition where members contributed either ships or money to a treasury on Delos. Simple in theory, but most cities had long since switched to paying cash instead of crewing ships, comfortable for merchants, but useless for actual defense. Athens took the gold and built its own fleet, and by 466 BC, the League's navy was, in all but name, Athens' navy. Cimon knew what most Athenian politicians preferred not to admit. 350 Persian ships at the Eurymedon were an invasion in preparation, waiting only for reinforcement before pushing into the Aegean. He framed the question not as whether to strike, but when. The first question for him was already settled. He demanded 200 triremes from the allies, and while the assembly debated, he simply began arming the fleet. Recruiters swept the markets of Piraeus, shipyards doubled their shifts, hoplites received orders. 200 triremes meant some 40,000 men at the oars alone. Cimon had already chosen his target before the debates ended. The Eurymedon itself, the river the Persians thought was a safe rear base. Before sailing, Cimon rewrote naval doctrine. The standard Athenian trireme was built purely for speed. Narrow hull, 170 rowers, a bronze ram, strike and retreat. Cimon broke that mold. Shipyard carpenters widened decks, removed upper rowing benches, and raised the gunwales, all to carry far more heavily armed hoplites than any standard design allowed. The ships grew heavier and lost agility, and everyone involved knew it. But the logic was brutal and simple. The Persian fleet sat crammed in a river mouth with no room to maneuver, so Greek speed would count for little there. What would decide the fight instead was how many armored men could win a close-quarters brawl once the ramming was done. As hammers rang in the shipyards, word spread along the coast that Cimon was sailing east with 200 ships. It reached cities that officially belonged to the League while secretly paying Persian tribute, a common, quietly hypocritical arrangement many called pragmatism. Cimon had no patience for it. Sailing south along Lycia, he forced every town on his route to choose: open your harbor and side openly with the League, or bar your gates against 200 triremes of heavy infantry. Most opened without much delay. One did not. Phaselis, a wealthy fortified port on the Lycian-Pamphilian border, calculated that Athens would pass through while Persia would remain, and chose to wait it out. Cimon's fleet arrived at dawn, blockaded the harbor, and turned away every envoy sent to talk. What followed was less a siege than a slow economic strangling. No ship in or out, fishermen trapped, hoplites holding the beach. Allied sailors from Chios, who knew the city from years of trade, proposed firing messages tied to arrows over the walls, telling the besieged what they already suspected. The Persian fleet was too far away and too busy waiting to save them. After several days of these arrow-borne letters, the gates opened. Phaselis joined the League, paid 10 talents, and pledged ships. Cimon pressed on toward the waters, where 350 Persian Chios still waited for Cyprus. Cimon moved deliberately down the coast, making sure no hostile port remained behind him to threaten his supply lines. Most cities chose reason quickly once 200 anchored triremes came into view, and Cimon offered terms dressed as partnership. Join the League, contribute ships or funds, receive Athenian protection. In substance, it was an ultimatum wrapped in diplomacy, and where towns resisted longer than necessary, he made the cost visible fast. Trampled fields, seized fishing boats, no massacres. Just precise pressure no small coastal town could outlast. By the time the fleet left Phaselis behind, the crews had grown into a cohesive force, having sailed the entire Lycian coast without losing a ship. Fresh reports arrived. The Persian fleet still hadn't moved, still waiting at the Eurymedon for the 80 Phoenician ships that would tip the balance decisively. The window remained open, but nobody knew for how long, and waiting now was not caution. It was a defeat already half-written. At sunrise, the fleet weighed anchor and turned east, rowers working a steady rhythm, while ahead lay a river mouth where a Persian armada rested easy, expecting Phoenicians, about to meet Athenians instead. The Persian commanders, Tithraustes and Pharyndates, reasoned that holding position was sound. Don't risk the fleet at sea before reinforcements arrive, and let numbers decide things later. Their confidence wasn't baseless. 350 ships crewed by the finest sailors of the eastern Mediterranean were a real deterrent simply by existing. But a deterrent only works if the enemy notices and backs off. One ordinary morning, a sentry scanning the horizon mistook what he saw for low clouds, a dark line slowly resolving into masts and sails, dozens, then hundreds, until 200 ships spanned the horizon. Chaos erupted instantly in the Persian camp. Officers ran for the command tents, rowers still ashore scrambled for their ships, and 350 vessels resting at ease lurched into disorganized motion, with no plan ready for a sudden enemy. Tithraustes saw at once that his fleet wasn't battle-ready. No formation, crews still on land, anchors not raised. He ordered his ships out to open water to form a proper line. The order was correct. It came too late. As Persian crews scrambled to untangle their ships, the Athenians closed the gap faster than anyone could react. Vessels pouring out of the narrow river mouth crowded straight into each other. No room to maneuver, oars shattering on contact, ships spinning helplessly the moment they lost oars on one side. That was exactly the moment Cimon's widened decks paid off. Instead of pulling back for another ramming run, his ships locked bow to bow, grapples flew, and armored hoplites stormed onto Persian decks. Persian crews were sailors first, and soldiers a distant second, no match for men advancing shield to shield in what had become infantry combat on wood. Within hours, the Persian fleet ceased to exist as a fighting force. Some 200 ships captured or sunk, survivors fleeing toward shore believing land meant safety. They had no idea Cimon had already made his next call. Rather than rest his exhausted men, he judged that a Persian army which had just watched its own navy annihilated was, for this one evening, more vulnerable than it would ever be again. Plutarch records that Cimon thought it shameful to let the Persians recover after such a victory at sea, and pushed his hoplites straight into a landing while the enemy still reeled with shock. The assault was brutal, men wading ashore under arrow fire, forming ranks in motion rather than from a standstill. Persian cavalry, poised to hit the vulnerable landing force, never got the order to charge. Tithraustes hesitated at the decisive instant, and the moment slipped away. When the lines met, Persian troops gave ground before the relentless machinery of the phalanx, each shield covering a neighbor's exposed side. The left flank broke first, the center followed, and within minutes retreat became a rout straight into the Persian camp, Athenians pressing so close behind that the gates could never be shut. Chaotic fighting among tents and wagons ended with the capture of the command tents themselves, full of gold and supplies testifying to an empire that had drained tribute from half the known world. Tithraustes vanishes from the record at this point. No source says whether he died, fled, or surrendered. As the camp fell silent that evening, scouts reported that the 80 long-awaited Phoenician ships had finally appeared, sailing toward a fleet and camp that no longer existed. Cimon ordered his men back to sea immediately. Waiting for morning would let the Phoenicians see the disaster and flee home with a warning. His fleet caught them in darkness before they could form a line, and by dawn, only a remnant limped back to Cyprus with news of total catastrophe. Word reached the Persian court at Susa weeks later, and what followed was telling by its absence. No new fleet ordered, no revenge campaign, even though the empire could easily have rebuilt 350 ships within a few years. The Aegean stopped being a place where Persian power was assumed, and the wavering Anatolian cities finally had their answer about who held real power. The Delian League got the naval monopoly it was built for, and Athens got something more, a windfall of captured gold that, Plutarch notes, helped fund the Acropolis's southern wall, stone paid for with Persian treasure. Cimon returned home a hero, having destroyed a fleet, broken an army, and wiped out reinforcements in a single day. The Eurymedon never entered popular memory the way Marathon or Salamis did, because it lacks their story of desperate survival. Here, Athens struck first, chose the time and place, and executed the campaign with a precision that left the enemy almost no room for error. The destruction of a threat before it could fully form, in the one narrow window before reinforcements arrived. History doesn't record what would have happened had Cimon waited 2 more weeks. It only records what did happen. 200 triremes sailing at exactly the right moment, closing a door that could never reopen again.